Welcome to Authentically Debz, my podcast. A Southern girl who looks at 70. Before I go on any further about living rather in Dallas and then eventually leaving Dallas, there's a couple of things I want to mention that happened before I left Little Rock and moved myself and my two little girls to Dallas. It was when I was in the throes of experiencing a very belated adolescence. And again, I would not recommend this to anyone. This is nothing I'm necessarily proud of, but I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I think this is how I would describe my adolescence, which I had at about age 25, I think, maybe 24 and 25. But when I had the breakfast room, it was in Western Little Rock, and it was in a very cool part of the city at the time, and early 70s, and I lived in the Watergate apartments, not the same as the DC, but they're still pretty cool in the Heights. I obviously must have had some girlfriends, but what I remember is going to Shakey's Pizza Parlor in the evening and listening to a guy that was quite a bit older than me at that time singing. That's where he sang. His first name was Bob, and he was an old hippie. And boy, could he sing. Could he sing. He sang all the songs that were popular then. I don't know that he had ever written a song of his own, but he sang especially well Jimmy Buffett songs. And I loved listening to him. He lived near the Watergate apartments, the Shakey's Pizza was near the Watergate apartments. So I went there just often to hear him sing. He was good, and especially for Little Rock. And he took a notice of me. I mean, I was like a groupie. I guess I was there every night. So Bob and I began a little, I guess you could call it an affair. I loved his talent. I loved his singing. He wasn't that great in bed at all. It was just kind of disappointing, but I did continue it for a little while. And I was such a Cinderella at that point, and the Cinderella complex was alive and well with me. I kept trying to think in my head, how can I make this work with him and my two kids? And of course, this was the furthest thing from his mind. I'm sure he was used to having, local groupies all the time, but he liked me. And, we did see each other quite regularly. But also, in the apartment where I lived, the Watergate, there was, I noticed across from me, a young man. I noticed there was a young woman there, but I didn't pay much attention to her. This young man was a little younger than me, perhaps, about 6 feet tall, natural blonde, curly hair, tan, very, I won't say rough looking, I will say rustic. And I'm pretty brave now. In fact, I think I'm truly braver than I've ever been. At that point, I was just kind of crazy brave. And I knew I was a little older than him, and like I say, I was not probably 25. He may have been 21, 22 maybe. And these were nice apartments, swimming pool, the whole thing. But I would flirt with him, and I never knew whether he really knew that I was flirting with him, but I would say hello and try to make small talk. And frankly, I always looked good back then, and certainly thought I looked good. Confidence is half of it, at least. And one night or one evening, I invited him over. And I think for the first time he realized, hey, this person's interested in me. And I was pretty attractive then, so it didn't take much for him to pick up on it. And we had fabulous sex. Now, the part that's not so good is that my children were also there. But this was late. They were asleep. They didn't wake up. And they were little, truly. But this didn't go on that long because he did have a girlfriend who I think actually lived with him, which complicated things. I never, even in my Cinderella complex years, I never entertained a life with this guy. I just enjoyed him. And compared to the sex that I was having with the older hippie singer, it was really nice. So here I was running a store, managing it, being mother of two, and juggling that pretty nicely, and seeing two people at the same time, sexually. So, oh my goodness, guess what happened? I became pregnant again. Well, now I'm divorced. And by the way, I haven't seen hide nor hair of my ex-husband. So that part was good. I do think at this point he was probably almost married again. I'm just going to interject at this point that my kids told me that Daddy said he was going to marry the next person, the next woman that walked through the door. And the next person that walked through the door turned out to be his second wife. They swear that's true. But I realized I was pregnant. And amazingly, in the early 70s in Little Rock, you could get abortions. It was just no big deal. They had abortion clinics, and people weren't lined up outside with, protest placards, killing babies and that kind of thing. So I never knew whose child it was, but if I was a betting person, and I never bet on money, I just kind of bet on my life, it was no doubt this younger man's. And I had my second abortion. And no, I didn't have my second. That was my first abortion. I had a miscarriage and an abortion. So I lost two babies, both intentional, which is, again, nothing I'm really proud of, but it is the truth. And let's see. Let's get back to Dallas now. Oh, another funny thing happened while I was in Dallas. And again, I had this crazy, cocky bravery that could have probably gotten me killed, but it never did. Just kind of turned out to be fun, but the abortions weren't fun, or the abortion wasn't fun. But in Dallas, I felt like I needed a music system. I hadn't bought a home in Dallas. I hadn't even opened the store yet because I'd gotten so carried away with, writing and recording original songs, country songs primarily. But I had this man come over from an audio store. Turned out to be a cute young man. And he put together an audio system for me. And we just started talking, and he ended up asking me out. He said, would you like to go to a Jackson Browne concert with me? And even I knew who Jackson Browne was. And I said, sure. I don't even think I went to a concert in Little Rock. Yeah, I think I did. I think I went to the Hall & Oates concert, for you oldies out there. And it was so choreographed. I remember that it was just like, it was almost not real. It was so choreographed. And then I went to Fleetwood Mac concert in Little Rock. That was quite amazing. Now, I didn't smoke. I didn't drink hardly either. Although I'm an alcoholic, it didn't take much to get me drunk. And the only time I was ever drunk was when I was with my boyfriend then, but my eventual husband. And I do remember once I had gotten drunk on peppermint schnapps. Oh my God. And I noticed that when I got home or the next morning that I had hickeys all over my neck. And fortunately it was winter or at least fall, and I had to wear turtlenecks for a week. And my mother, God bless her, I don't even think she noticed. And I was her life, or she didn't care, but I think I wore the same turtleneck every day for days. Okay, getting back to this young audio guy in Dallas. When he picked me up, I don't think I slept with him, amazingly. And I did have a person to keep my children. She was a housekeeper, but she was also a sitter for me. And my oldest daughter told me later that she was awful. I didn't know that. I wasn't told that at the time. Hopefully it would have mattered. But I went with him that night to the Jackson Browne concert, and he brought over, or are on the way, because we certainly didn't do it in front of the children, but he brought over some weed. I'd never smoked weed. That's what hippies did. And remember, I lived behind the Iron Curtain in the South during the 60s. So I tried it, and I reminded myself of a movie I saw recently. It's been out several years now with Alec Baldwin and Meryl Streep. I think it's called It's Complicated. And when she was much older, she shared some weed with her boyfriend at the time, the actor Steve Martin, in the film. And she just began looking at the dash of the car they were in and saying, wow, I've never seen a radio like that, or something like that. But that's the way my first experience with marijuana affected me. And I remember saying to him, I'm thinking of things I've never thought of before. And I'm sure he thought, oh my God, where did I get this one? So really my first experience with weed was good. But I found that when I tried it later and subsequently, that it really made me get more into my head. And for me, that meant depression usually. So it was not my drug of choice at all. But that first time was fun, and the concert was magnificent. Oh, I just thought of this as I was mentioning the fact that I had a young woman actually, that kept the children for me and cleaned up the house. We rented a lovely old home in the Oaklawn district of Dallas. I have no idea what it's like now, but then it was definitely cutting edge, but cool. At any rate, when my mother and I, now we go way back, I just have to tell you this. My mother and I lived in Stamps, Arkansas. We rented this little house. First of all, we started living in a garage apartment, but then we rented a little house on a street called Noel Street. And the rent for that house was $40 a month, okay? But no matter how poor we were, or I never felt poor. I never felt drop dead rich, but I just felt like, I had everything I wanted. But no matter where we were, what circumstance we were in, we always had a maid. And they were generally always black. And this nice young woman that we had in Stamps, I remember my mother paid her, I think she only came probably once a week. We paid her $2 a day, okay? Oh my God. And then you also have to consider that my mother's first annual teaching salary was $2,700. And this was in the, very early 60s. My things have changed. Even in Haynesville, they had a picture show, or a movie theater, but we called it the picture show. And do you know, I'm now 70. I can remember going to, it's hard to believe that a town that small would have a picture show, but it did. And I remember paying a nickel to get into that movie theater. Then I remember paying a dime, and eventually it went up to a quarter. And my God, soon it went up to 50 cents. I saw such things as the Red Monster, the Green Monster, Roy Rogers, Dale Evans, Lash LaRue, my favorite badass cowboy, the Lone Ranger. And I remember when my grandmother died, they sent all the kids to the picture show in the family. And my mother not knowing what it was, and I guess they had censors back then, but maybe everyone knew everyone in Haynesville. Maybe they knew that my grandmother had died and they had sent all the children to the movies. And I saw Butterfield 8 with Elizabeth Taylor. And that was one of the more risque things I did at that age, other than flirting rampantly with that little black boy that I told you about. Because, Elizabeth Taylor's character was a prostitute. So, anyway. Okay, now we're back in Dallas, okay? And as it turns out, I'm not going to open my second breakfast room because I have now somehow managed to become the chick singer for a rock and roll band in Dallas. I was singing Bruce Springsteen songs. I was singing rock and roll, and I could sing. I could write better, but I could sing. They weren't playing country music. They were playing, I guess you could say, soft rock. And did that for a while. Fortunately, I still had a little money. And then through a studio musician, I got connected up with another band that had a gig in Los Angeles. And, well, I wanted to go. And my best friend that I had met at the Dallas show some years ago now, she had visited me in Dallas now. She visited me in Little Rock also. Lived in Manhattan Beach, suburb of Los Angeles. I wanted to go, and I full well expected, okay, here's my shot. That's how crazy I was then. I'm going to go out there. I'm going to make it as a musician, or certainly a songwriter, and I'm going to bring my kids out. And what I did was I left my kids with my ex-husband and his then second wife, and I moved to Los Angeles. And we did the gig, which was not more than 5 performances. And one of them was actually in the South Bay, which is where my friend lived in Manhattan Beach. And I lived with her. She was going through her first divorce at that time. I hadn't been there more than a few weeks. And she had this fabulous house. It was a family home originally in Manhattan Beach. And I hadn't been there long at all when I got a certified letter in the mail, and it was from Ronnie, and he was demanding full custody of the girls. And this was just something so out of the blue. My money had just about run out now, and I just couldn't bring him out then. I couldn't even fight him. So there began my time away from my children, which had a huge effect on both of them, and especially the older one, who was by that time, gosh, how old was she? She was 6 or 7 and worshiped the ground I walked on, and still does, and I don't know why. Because, and I'll bring this up at this point, one obsession I had while I was pregnant with my oldest child, and I finally admitted this to her the other night. She knew I had anorexia when I was pregnant with her, and thank God I didn't have it the first 3 or 6 months. I developed it the last 3 months of the pregnancy. I remember I ate 1 meal a day. I had a big bowl of cereal with usually grape nuts and bananas and a cup of coffee, and that's all I ate. And then I did the same thing the next day and the next day. And by the time I had my child, my first child, I think I weighed about 100 pounds. I looked like someone from Auschwitz or Dachau. My poor mother, toward the end of that pregnancy, we were living with her, and she would cook me the most magnificent meals. And remember, this is the mom that made hors d'oeuvres, but she either learned to cook or went out of her way to just cook me these fabulous meals, and I just wouldn't eat anything. I just wouldn't. But about 2 weeks after I had my baby, and she was born weighing 6 pounds amazingly. The only thing that was not completely normal with Heather was that her little feet were turned in. And I think a gross way to describe the condition now would be saying she had club feet. But we took her to the orthopedic and surgeon, and he straightened them, and she screamed bloody murder. And babies' bones aren't really, I don't even know if they're actually bones yet. Maybe they're something else close to bones. But she had to wear a brace for a while, and her feet are fine now. But that could have happened with all the crazy exercising I was doing toward the end. And I told her the other night, I said, it's a wonder you're even here. And my oldest daughter has had, I do believe it takes 2 to tango, so I don't feel totally, utterly responsible. But she has had a hell of a life so far, and she'll be 50 in June. And I think a lot of the emotional and even physical problems she's had have something to do with the fact that I was anorexic during my pregnancy with her. Such a dangerous thing to do. My obsession was controlling my weight, and the way I did it was just simply by not eating. And I thought I was so cool, and I thought that, they say, I really thought I was fat. Of course I was fat. I just had this big ball of pregnancy sticking out the front of me. And I have a friend now that she thinks she's fat, and she's she almost looks like I did, as emaciated as I did. And it's a body dysmorphia or something. But that was another form of my OCD. Okay, so now I'm in LA and I don't have my kids, and looks like I'm not going to have them for a little while unless I can figure something out. This was sad to me, but I was still pretty crazed with OCD, and so, the show must go on. From working with different studio musicians and getting to know some of the music people in the area, I hooked up with, and not hooked up the way it means now, but I connected with a musician, actually a friend of mine, a bass player, who, as I recall, was a true friend. And he told me that this band that had formed recently was going to New York, and they were going on tour of upstate New York, but it was going to end in Manhattan. And it was about 8 weeks worth of work, but it was in the dead of winter. And I'd been in LA then, I guess, about 6 months. I had even started my fallback of teaching, or at least substitute teaching, I think in La Mirada for a little bit. And then I remember I just briefly moved out of my friend's place and lived in Malibu for a second. But then I was off to New York. I did survive that blizzard-filled tour when it ended in Manhattan in New York, and not in Manhattan Beach in California, when it ended in Manhattan in New York. The rest of the band pretty immediately returned to LA. I guess most of them had been to New York, and the cold weather that we had to endure in Syracuse and even Buffalo, it was just ungodly. And again, I was singing rock music, but I was determined that I was going to experience the Big Apple, because here I was. I remained in New York City and Manhattan on my own, just me and my OCD. I stayed there 3 years. I call it the agony and the ecstasy. It's truly the only place I've ever lived where once you walked out your door in the morning, anything could happen. Good, bad, miraculous, horrific. Nothing bad really happened to me as far as a mugging or anything like that, because I always had an agenda. I used to look at street people then, and I used to look at elderly people then, and I'm like, why don't you go west? Or why don't you go to a small town? This is not the place for you. New York was pretty cool. I remember that their firemen were unlike any firemen I've seen since, but they would be on the way to a fire, and they'd be on top of some of them would be on top of the fire truck, and today it would not be politically correct at all, but on the way to the fire, they would see you and they would say, "Hey, looking good today, babe." And I don't know, it was just cool to me then. I just thought, go put out your fire. You're looking cool too. But New York was definitely a trip. It's sort of like growing older. It's not for sissies at all. Because it's like, being in New York is like, it can be like being hit by a Mack truck. The people seem gruff, but they're just bottom line. There's really not that many bullshitters in New York, or if they are, they're so polished that it's hard, especially for a little Southern girl like I was then, to figure out that they were bullshitters. But people were genuine, and it was really important to have friends, or at least one good friend in New York. I remember having to layer myself in clothing. I did end up purchasing a fur coat. I know that's not cool, but at that point, I was freezing to death. I think one thing that saved me in New York, of all things, something actually positive that I got from my fucked up, dysfunctional, racist family, and that was that this was instilled in me as a kid. I still innocently believed that nothing bad would happen to me because I was so loved as a child. All I can say to that is, go figure. So here I am in New York City with my OCD, like I mentioned. Two things I want to mention about New York that might be kind of out of order, but one of them is I'm just getting to New York now. But while I was in New York for those 3 years, one year, one Christmas, it was so cold and the heat went completely out of my little studio apartment, which I think was Upper East Side. I lived everywhere in New York, like I would live everywhere in San Francisco. In LA, I pretty much stayed in the South Bay, except for my brief stint in Malibu years ago. But anyway, it was so cold in New York that Christmas. I think it was 1 degrees outside. It probably wasn't that much warmer inside because I had no heat. So I remember that Christmas day, and I think this was before I bought my fur coat, so I was just layered up. And I don't know where, I had a best friend, but I don't know where she was. So I ended up going to movies all day just so I could stay warm. I'm not sure what I did that evening, whether I went to my friends or whether I just stayed layered and covered myself up with all the blankets I could muster. Another thing about New York is that after I'd been there a while, I experienced what I'm sure a lot of New Yorkers do, and a lot of the poor cab drivers, or now would be the poor Uber or Lyft drivers, experience would be displaced anger. If I had a great day, I would be so nice to the cab driver, but I never permitted them to take advantage of me once I knew the city, and New York was an easy city to learn. I told them exactly the way I wanted to go, but if I'd had a bad day, I would often displace that anger about something else entirely from the cab driver to the cab driver. And I knew I was doing it. Perhaps I could have even stopped it, but it was so natural, and I knew that the cabbie paid me no attention really, probably, or I hope not. But I did that a lot. I had a lot of displaced anger there. The kids that I teach now, the youth at risk, particularly the incarcerated youth, they exhibit a lot of that. So I totally get it. Okay, now I'm in New York City, and it's for the first time. Luckily, very luckily for me, I had a high school friend who was a pretty good friend in high school who was staying in Brooklyn at that time. Somehow I managed to get her number. I contacted her. She was not staying there with her own apartment. She was staying with a friend in Brooklyn, but it was cool that I stayed there for a little while. And I definitely took her up on that. So I caught a train from Manhattan and went directly to Brooklyn. I will say something at this point about the Manhattan subway system. The last time I was in Manhattan was about 12 or 13 years ago on a teacher trip. I was amazed at how much cleaner it was. And when I lived there, the late 70s, and I didn't take any subways when I was there on the teacher trip. But the subway system was insane in Manhattan. I don't know if they've made it a little more sane at this point, but it was very difficult to understand. You just kind of had to feel your way through it. But since I've always excelled in abstraction, somehow I learned it probably quite quickly, amazingly, because it made no sense. Anyway, that's just an aside. So I'm in Brooklyn, and I think if I did something like that now, I would just be in abject terror. I would be so anxious, but I was just kind of in the moment. Go figure that too. I remember I had some kind of I want to say risotto or some kind of spread that it was so good, that you put on your toast in the morning. I'd never had it before in my life. I remember I had that in Brooklyn. So when my friend left to go back to the South, which is where she was from, I think she was heading for New Orleans, I left Brooklyn as well. And I landed in the West Village. And this was around, I think, 1979. Again, I don't purport to know what the West Village is like now in New York City, but at that point it was very gay. I felt very at home there. I felt very safe. I'm sure there were lesbians there, but all I encountered were gay guys. I found some dumpy little apartment that, well, you really couldn't even call this, it was not a habitable apartment. I just found it and kind of started staying there, and the landlord found out I was there, and he said, "You can't stay here, even if you pay me, because this is not fit to rent yet." And so I just begged him to let me stay there for, a week or so, or as long as I could. And he did, and finally he just said, "I can't let you stay here anymore, because if something happens to you, this apartment is not habitable." I don't even remember if it had a restroom, but I just needed a place to stay that wasn't right on the street, right? And it was cold. I did manage to find some heat in that building, though, which was kind of strange. I don't know quite how I did, but anyway, after I left there, this all transpired in the West Village of New York, which I guess used to be called Greenwich Village also. I found another dumpy little apartment, but this apartment had a roommate, and he was a guy from the Middle East. And I remember watching with him on his TV there the overthrow of the Shah of Iran and the subsequent return of the long-exiled Khomeini to power. I also remember that it was there in that apartment that I endured my first and only ever true migraine headache. My youngest daughter used to have frequent migraines once she reached adulthood, but she's taken medication. She rarely has them now. I think that's kind of the way migraines do. They kind of run their course. But that was the only one I've ever had, and I don't really know what caused it, except that perhaps I was finally just overcome with everything I had done and that I was currently doing. Soon after that, through another old friend, and this was briefly a boyfriend, in fact, who was actually from New York and Jewish, and he was living in Manhattan. And I guess I had saved his number because I had met him when I was living in Dallas and was thinking of opening my second gourmet store, and he was one of my suppliers to my Little Rock store. So obviously I must have saved his number and called him, and when he came over and saw firsthand where and how I was living and with whom I was living, and there was nothing wrong with the man I was living with. It was just kind of a dire situational thing, at least the way it looked. He connected me with a former girlfriend of his who needed a roommate, and voila! I moved in with her rather immediately on the Upper West Side of New York. In fact, I wrote a song about the Upper West Side of New York, and it wasn't when I was living with this lady whose name was Valerie, but it was when I was living in a residence for women, which would come a little later. You know I'm going to sing. You just know I'm going to sing a bar or two. I got a room on the Upper West Side of New York. It's for women only, but the boys sneak in, of course. And it ain't so fine, but it's mine. And it gives me peace to know at least I got my room on the Upper West Side of New York. And that's all I remember of that. Or that's all the time I'm going to take to try to remember it at this point. So I move in with his friend Valerie, and not counting the inhabitable residence I did live in initially in Manhattan, this was the second of my residences in New York City. Valerie was an offbeat kind of young woman. She was a dental hygienist. We got along swell. Her apartment had a really strange design. I found out that it had originally been 2 apartments, and the owner had actually divided it in half to make 2 apartments so that I guess he could get 2 rents instead of 1. But when you open the front and only door to Valerie's apartment, and I'm not kidding, to the immediate right was a kitchen the size of a closet, followed by a very long hallway, which was the pathway to the living room, which was pretty spacious. And then if you kept going, you would run into the bathroom at the exact end of the hallway, with a bedroom on each side of the bathroom. So as soon as you stepped into that apartment and looked down the hallway, the long hallway, you could see the bathroom. And I have to mention that a funny thing happened when my two little southern aunts from Louisiana visited me there shortly after I moved in with Valerie. They had never been to New York City, and they wanted to see me, and they definitely wanted to see the city. So one of them, I think I probably have mentioned Aunt Ibby. She was my favorite. She was actually sitting on the toilet, or like we called it down south, the commode, and just like Aunt Ibby, she left the bathroom door open when suddenly in comes Valerie's, my roommate's then Latino boyfriend, George, through the front door, who just naturally peered down the hallway only to see my 76-year-old aunt sitting on the throne. She was suddenly horrified, but she decided not to get up and close the door because that would only have exposed her further. And I still laugh hysterically about this to the day. I'm sure that I must have eventually closed the door, but this was hysterically funny. Okay, so I'm living with Valerie on the Upper West Side. I will say something else about Valerie. There were a lot of Jewish people in New York City. And Valerie, I guess with the accent, I thought, God, she is Jewish, but she wasn't Jewish. She was definitely a WASP, but her family was from Barbados. Yes, in the Caribbean. She was a redhead with freckles. So while I was living with her, I very soon began working on my regular fallback, my teaching degree, rising very early every morning to take 2 trains or subways and then a bus from Yankee Stadium to teach a special kindergarten class in the South Bronx. And I do remember that for the first time ever, I saw a beef tongue served to my students, the children. That was a real first for me. Another real first for me, and especially I noticed it in the South Bronx, was, and for just New York City in general, the first time I ever felt like a minority. It was diversity personified. And I thank God for that. I thank God for that experience. But it was a novel feeling. Getting back to the cow's tongue, I couldn't imagine eating a cow's tongue. Well, I just never had. I remember before I saw the tongue, I remember that the children were very excited because every Thursday for lunch they had tongue. When I saw the little plates put out with the tongue on each plate, a beef tongue, I almost gagged because it literally looked like a big cow's tongue. But the children loved it. They devoured it. They were ecstatic about it. I mentioned feeling like a minority, but I will also mention that the graciousness of the people in the South Bronx. In the South Bronx, at least the part I was in at that point, was quite a rough neighborhood, to say the least. It looked that way, and it truly was that way. But every day, leaving that school, on my way to the bus at Yankee Stadium, one of my parents, or maybe a big sister or brother of one of my students, would walk me to that bus to make sure I was safe. They were my escorts, and that was so terribly kind. And I won't ever forget that. So teaching was what I did during the day, and each night, I was youthful then. I don't even think I'd turned 30. After working all day, taking 2 trains back and forth, which makes 4 trains, and then 2 buses. Then I would take a train that night to the village. I would come home and change clothes, of course, and then sing my original country tunes at various funky little nightclubs, again in the West Village. And there were many of those little joints back then. One was called Folk City. One was the Bitter End. I think I'll mention that a little further later. I would make a little money and always prayed that someone of importance from the music industry might frequent one of those little clubs in Manhattan, in the Village, might like one of my songs and could possibly help me sell one of them. Again, I was not a great vocalist, and I was definitely more of a lyricist than a composer, but it was country music after all, not Mozart. And I might add, except for a few of them, my songs were very traditional country. Maybe not quite Loretta Lynn or Tammy Wynette, but pretty traditional. I will say that on the way to my nighttime gig, late in the afternoon, I was on the way to one of those little clubs in the village, and someone walked past me. Oh, actually, he was coming toward me and walked past me. And I didn't realize who it was until after he passed me, and then someone stopped him and asked for an autograph, and he graciously gave it to them. And it was Johnny Cash. That was a cool thing I'll remember. So by this time, I've been writing songs for a few years. And like I said, it was like manna from heaven during that period when I wrote country songs. The sky opened and a song was born. And thank God the lyrics and the music came gratefully at the same time. It was easy then. But the routine was tiring. I was up so early and out so late. Even for someone my age, a soon-to-be 30-year-old, it was hard. I never sold a song, but I did get close once, and I've already, I think, sung you that song because I'm not going to sing it again right now. It's called Give Me a Little Love. But no, I didn't end up selling it. And I may have also mentioned this, but if I had to look at those songs, which I don't even know, to tell you the truth, after recording all those songs, I don't even know where the original cassette is or the reel for those songs, because back then we had reel-to-reels for music. But I would have to have all of the songs rearranged because you listen to country music now, which I actually like now. It's changed. So it so happened that at that time, I not only had my roommate, who I considered a good friend, but I had made friends with a former girlfriend of this guy that I dated in another Manhattan. That would be Manhattan Beach, California. My new female friend, Beth, was a Jew, and she was from Long Island, and quite unlike anyone I had ever known before or since. We could hardly have been more different, but she seemed to like me immediately, and I was then a still rather naive Southern girl. We started hanging out, and I didn't know what she did for work, but one night when I did not sing in the village, Beth asked me to go out with her. So we just went out, for drinks, got kind of dressed up. We went to this pretty fancy's not the right word, this pretty expensive bar on the Upper East Side. And actually, Beth lived on the Upper East Side. And just for a moment, I'll get back. I said she was the former girlfriend of a guy that I had dated in Manhattan Beach. I even wrote a song about him. He was kind of smitten with me. So when I came to New York, since he was originally from Brooklyn anyway, he came back to New York. Not with me, but shortly after I returned. He came back for a visit, and that's when he introduced me to Beth. So Beth and I are going out to dinner, or we were just going out to a bar, a club. And we were sitting there at that pretty expensive bar, and Manhattan is full of them, as I recall. Beth asked me point blank if I had ever turned a trick. No, I said, but I did want to know what it was. And she told me. And then she pointed to two older, well-dressed men also sitting at the bar who appeared to be there together, and she suggested that we try what she had just defined to me as turning a trick with them. And she said to just follow her lead. Beth was a striking, dark-haired beauty, and after she flirtingly smiled at them, they both came right over to join us. I watched as Beth cut the deal at the bar, and we actually left in a cab with these two out-of-town businessmen to their nearby hotel. It doesn't make it any better. It still was what it was. But this was a very nice bar, and this was a very nice hotel. Yes, all of this was coming rather easy to me, I must admit. Possibly, and I'm sure partially because of my OCD for the past few years. And I had been experiencing my long overdue adolescence, marrying the first boy I was ever with, being the perfect child, student, daughter to my precious emotional child of a mother. I really had never done anything really bad, so without giving any of it much thought, I decided to make up for lost time. And I also didn't think anything bad could happen to me because I was so loved. And besides, I knew what we were earning from this night, Beth had told me, and it was well more than a week's pay for me normally, and that included the teaching and the singing at night. And this was from one evening with Beth and these two, for lack of a better word, gents. Beth insisted that we stay together at all times, so we all met in one of their hotel rooms. And again, it was very upscale. We both chose our lucky guy, and before I knew it, it was over. They paid us. We had sex with them. This was high-class prostitution, but that's what it was. After they paid us, one of them, I think they did a little powwow, and then one of them asked us if they could see us, Beth and me, together. And so Beth told them that she would have to discuss this with me privately because she had not mentioned this to me at all. Now, this type of trick was completely out of my ballpark, of course, but Beth quickly explained that we would be acting, nothing to it, and we'd only do it if they doubled the price. Okay, I said, rather in a fog of a mind. They immediately took us up on Beth's financial offer, and it was showtime. Guess you could say that was my first acting gig, but I did it. She was my friend. I felt safe, and the performance was over in no time. We left those two men on cloud nine. I later found out that Beth was also raising a beautiful little boy whose name was Peter, who was the son of, I want to say, a former lover, but he was still kind of half-ass her lover. But she was much more in love with his little boy than she ever was with him. And she was also helping her younger brother, who was a little younger than us, finance the production he was producing off-Broadway. So he was a fledgling off-Broadway producer at the time. She was a tremendously giving and caring human being. And she was also financially very astute. Sad to say, I have now lost complete touch with her, but I do know that when I last heard, she had opened her own gym and she was doing well. If she's still alive, whatever she's doing, I'm sure she is a success at it, and I'm sure she's not doing what we did that night. But anyway, had to share that with you. Let's see. One thing I wanted to mention, and I may get more into this later, but at one of my gigs in the West Village, you often just had to go in and talk to the owner or the manager and just try to get in to sing there. And this place was called the Bitter End. I think they had another place, called the Other End or something. I may have played there too. But at this place, the owner liked me, probably more than he should have. But I got to open for the lyricist of the Grateful Dead. Now, everyone that night came to see that lyricist. They did not come to see Little Debbie Gray, country singer and songwriter. And I had to open for him. It was a relatively small nightclub, but it was packed. And there I was with my little band of musicians and my little original country songs, which weren't half bad then. Really, they weren't. But they were not the audience for me. They didn't boo me, but they did laugh quite a bit. They were not expecting what they heard for the first 15 or 20 minutes. I can't remember the guy's name from the Grateful Dead, the lyricist, but he was quite well known, and especially to that crowd. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Authentically Debz. And if you like my show, please subscribe, leave a review, and definitely tell a friend. Oh, and make sure to visit my website where you can keep up with my current projects, learn a little more about me, and follow my latest news. And that website is www.deborahjangray.com. The spelling is Debora, no H, Jan, Gray. And most importantly, blessings to everyone.